Well, good evening. Thank you so much for being here and for joining the Religion and Public Life program. Tonight we're going to address the vitally important issue of religion and global poverty. Though I must admit that we will merely scratch the surface in the time we have together. I'm Elaine Howard Ecklund. I'm the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology, and also the Director of the Religion and Public Life program. Where is the place for research in understanding the role of religion in creating and alleviating global poverty? We're sitting here tonight as a group of, at least in comparison to the rest of the world, wealthy Westerners. There is passionate debate by scholars and especially community leaders and people who are part of religious organizations who simply want to do something, to give, to stop hunger, to bring clean water. But let's stop for a moment. There's a parable that's attributed to several religious sources, and it goes like this. I bet some of you have heard it before. One summer in the village, the people in the town gathered for a picnic, and as they leisurely shared food and conversation, someone noticed a baby in the river, struggling and crying. The baby was going to drown. Someone rushed to save the baby. Then they noticed another screaming baby in the river, and they pulled that baby out. Soon more babies were seen virtually drowning in the river, and the townspeople were pulling them out as fast as they could. They didn't have enough resources. It took great effort. They began to organize their activities in order to save the babies as they came down the river. As everyone else was busy in the rescue efforts to save the babies, two of the townspeople started to run away from the effort along the shore of the river. "Where are you going?" shouted one of the rescuers. "We need your help here to save these drowning babies." "We're not going to be part of these efforts right now," they said. "We are going to go upstream to the source to figure out who is throwing babies in." In its worst form, the academy is often rightly criticized as being in the ivory tower with no central importance to help solve societal problems. But in its best form, universities can provide society safe spaces to stop and reflect, to listen to scholars, and for scholars to listen to practitioners, to people on the ground, to let us understand how research can inform greater effectiveness of important efforts. In the midst of hunger and poverty, there is need for those like us to have resources to have a radical call to action. But there's also need for reflection and right strategy, and that's what we're here to begin starting to accomplish just in a small piece tonight. Let me tell you a little bit more about our broad, overarching vision of the Religion and Public Life program. The vision of the Religion and Public Life program is to provide real research tools to think more deeply, to create better policy in response to the most pressing public religious issues that are facing our time. We aim to move beyond mere coexistence and towards reconciliation and creative action born out of the best research. In order to accomplish this vision, our team has been working hard, and we've come up with a three-armed strategy. First, we want to conduct top-notch research. We're part of a university. We want to conduct robust, multidisciplinary research on religion in the public sphere, research that takes place both locally but also globally. Second, we want to train scholars. We help students and scholars at all stages of their careers develop the right research tools to carry out their vision. And three, we want to touch communities. By offering programs like tonight's event, we want to provide spaces inside the university and outside it for better and deeper conversations about religion in the public sphere. Conversations that are informed by research that will lead to action, that will inform media coverage of religion, and that will lead to understanding. Just a bit of the practicals. The Religion and Public Life program was started in 2010 as part of the Social Sciences Research Institute at Rice University. As many of you know, this is a special year for us. This is our 5th year anniversary, and we're in the course of planning 7 events over this academic year, so watch for more events coming. Some of our successes that we're very proud of: over the past 5 years, we've completed 4 national or international studies, raising over $4 million in grant funding. We're in our final months of data collection for an 8-country study examining scientists' attitudes towards religion, and we're going to release some of that data and have a really wonderful public conversation about it on December 3rd. We're in the Biosciences Research Collaborative, the BRC, at 5:30. So December 3rd, 5:30. We'll invite you all in lots of different ways, but hope to get that on your calendar now. In addition to our success in research, we also have mentored 60 students and junior scholars and have hosted 40 events for the public. We brought 50 scholars to the Rice University's campus for our programming, and also often put those scholars in local community religious organizations and civic organizations outside the hedges. Our research and programming has been covered over 1,000 times by national and international media, and with your support, we're going to continue carrying out these strategies. Now back to the topic at hand. We can discuss poverty in many ways and from many approaches, but just a couple of stats to frame our conversation. In 2012, according to the World Bank, 12.7% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty, defined as living at or below $1.90 a day. This number is significantly lower in the 1980s, when those in extreme poverty climbed as high as 44%. However, despite this progress, we must put the percentages in perspective. 12.7% is equivalent to 896 million people around the world living in extreme poverty. And I know, I'm very aware that that's only one angle of many. Regionally, China and other parts of East Asia have seen dramatic drops in poverty rates. Today, the rate of extreme poverty is 7.2% in East Asia and about 19% in South Asia. It remains very high at 43% in sub-Saharan Africa. What's being done to combat global poverty, and how are religious organizations part of these efforts? Here we're going to look tonight to some extent at faith-based and non-faith-based NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. An NGO is not-for-profit and largely independent from government. As defined by the United Nations, NGOs are organized at local, national, international level. They address issues in support of the public good, also defined in many ways. They perform a variety of services and humanitarian functions. Faith-based NGOs are characterized the same, but with an added element of religion or spirituality. As we'll address later in this event, and as some of our esteemed panelists even do research on, it's very difficult to define exactly what a faith-based NGO is. One of our panelists, Evelyn Bush, has done research on this topic. And just briefly, of the 3,275 NGOs registered with the UN, 239 are classified as religious, and more than 70% of these consider themselves Christian. However, Muslim NGOs are also increasing in numbers. In our conversation today, we will address the tension surrounding these issues. For example, what challenges does a Christian organization face going into a heavily Muslim nation? What if a faith-based NGO's concept of development does not match that of a local context? Do donors or directors back home place pressure on faith-based NGOs and the people who work for them to act in certain ways? What are the best ways for local religious organizations, like churches and mosques, as well as persons of faith more broadly, to interface with religious NGOs? We cannot even begin to hope to fully answer these complex questions tonight. But this is a necessary conversation to have, and one goal tonight may be that you go away with better questions and more significant questions. Our panelists will present us with new insights and knowledge and help us think through practical things that we can do. And this whole conversation is really born out of the firm conviction that learning and being in dialogue is an essential step towards action. I'm grateful for our panelists and for the time that they've made and the preparations that they've made for this conversation. Elias Bongmba is the Harry and Hazel Siobhan Chair in Christian Theology and Professor of Religion at Rice University, all the way to my far right. He is president of the African Association for the Study of Religion. His expertise includes African diaspora religions and African studies. His book, Facing a Pandemic: The African Church and the Crisis of AIDS, addresses the HIV/AIDS crisis, and I've had the pleasure of reading that book over this past week, and I highly commend it. Elias argues that the image of God motif challenges religious communities in Africa to scale up the fight against HIV/AIDS through an ethic of love and compassion. He's currently writing a book on African religions. Evelyn Bush is Associate Professor of Sociology at Fordham University. I'm very fortunate to have known Evelyn for many years. We went to graduate school together at Cornell University. She's written extensively on the intersection of religion with the economy, human rights, and other areas, and is a core collaborator on the religious NGOs at the United Nations Project. She's also researching religious freedom and human rights of women by analyzing reports of the U.S. Department of State, and we're very, very grateful to have Evelyn with us. Rebecca Samuel Shah is a research fellow at the Berkeley Center of Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. You're sitting in the order of my remarks. Thank you. That wasn't even designed that way, just natural. She's also an associate scholar with the Berkeley Center's Religious Freedom Project and currently leads 2 research projects, one on religion, entrepreneurship, and economic development in the modern world, and the other on the effects of tithing and thrift on the enterprising poor in Bangalore, India. Thank you, Rebecca, for being with us. We just learned of Rebecca's work, and it was so relevant to this conversation that we were thrilled when she said she could come. Jonathan Wiles is Vice President for Program Excellence at Living Water International, where he leads their long-range strategic planning. Living Water International helps communities create sustainable water, sanitation, hygiene, all in a Christian context in partnership with local churches. Jonathan has extensive experience living and working abroad. For 6 years, he was based at Schloss Mittersill, an intentional Christian community and study center in Austria. He served as Director of Communications and a member of the senior leadership team. And we had the pleasure of meeting a few months ago, and I thought, here's someone who has a whole lot of education but knows how to speak in practical language. We need that, more of that in the academy, so I asked him to come along. For more extensive bioinformation, see your program. I also want to point your attention to something we're just have been doing these last couple of programs, which is that we have given you, promise not in an onerous way, a little insert of research on the topic, as well as some quotes from the panelists. And hope you'll look at that, now or later. I'd love to have feedback on whether or not you think those are the right takeaway points, if that's useful for you. We want you to have something that you can take home with you from this conversation. Very excited about that. Finally, you'll find a comment card, and we want to hear your opinion on tonight's event. We want to hear your thoughts anonymously, unless you want us to be in touch with you. Be sure to say your thoughts and then drop them off at the registration table. And finally, allow me to explain the flow of tonight's event. So first, each panelist has prepared just a few minutes of remarks based on his or her experiences. Next, I will direct a few questions to the entire panel that were written by our esteemed Rice University undergraduate students, hard questions, so be ready. And I also then will open the floor to you to answer your questions. So don't be passive, right? So while they're talking, while I'm asking them questions, you be thinking of what your hardest questions are, and then be ready to submit them to us. You can submit them to us by raising your hand and speaking them out loud, or you can submit them to us over Twitter at Rice RPLP, at Rice RPLP. I'll alternate between questions from the audience and from Twitter. There's a better chance that we'll get to your question if you tweet it, okay? So let's just take advantage of that amazing opportunity that we have. And finally, again, this is just the beginning. One of the most significant things that may happen to you tonight is the kind of relationships you form in this event with like-minded others. And so we're going to have a really nice reception after. Please stick around. Say hi to old friends, but try hard to meet someone new, too. Okay, thank you for being here tonight. All right. Now I'm going to sit down, and then each of you are going to give some remarks. I guess I'll sit over there on this end chair, which has been prepared for me. Thank you. And they're going to give a few orienting remarks, okay? And then we'll have some more formal questions. So,
Can we do it from here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good evening and welcome. I think Dr. Ecklund has already defined what we are going to focus on this evening. And that is that the war against, and I hate to use that word war because everything is always defined as a war, and in a real sense it is, against poverty is fought at many levels, and one of those levels is the religious communities. And the religious communities are part of the non-governmental sector, except that they are defined and called faith-based organizations, largely because they go out to the world based on a cosmology or a worldview that recognizes that there is a divine being, and that in order to follow that divine being, human beings come together as communities of faith. In the United States, these organizations are generally registered as non-for-profit or not-for-profit organizations, I should say, with the Internal Revenue Services. But in other parts of the world, they are also expected to be registered with their governments. And so the faith is the key. I think my colleagues probably will define that much better than myself, but the reason I say faith is the key is simply to underscore the fact that these groups and these individuals go out into the world largely because they have a faith commitment and they belong to a religious community. This is something that we see across the board. Most of the information that I am aware of, I came across that when I was working on the book on HIV/AIDS, and then another book on the decline of the state in Africa, which is titled The Dialectics of Transformation in Africa. And it is then that I realized that Africa was going through a massive NGOization, as it was called in those days. There were NGOs everywhere, and there were faith-based organizations everywhere. So to begin, let me put something on the table. If you were to ask me, honestly, to speak from my gut feelings, what do I feel? And I'm departing from my prepared remarks here about faith-based organizations. I will tell you, pardon the word, I swear by them. I think they have a place. They belong in the context in which they are doing things. We need to take them at their word and see them as serious participants in the attempt to make life livable for many, many people around the world. Now, beyond that kind of statement, which sounds like advocacy, I think we can say a number of things about them. They're very diverse. Diverse either ideologically, and in my prepared remarks, diverse theologically. Even the faith-based ones, the Christian ones, when they go out to serve the general public, even without discrimination, because they serve everybody, they are still generally always informed by a certain theological viewpoint. Take, for instance, Samaritan's Purse by the Reverend Franklin Graham. He doesn't discriminate against anybody, but there is no doubt that Samaritan's Purse and all they do around the world is informed by a perspective that has grown out of the evangelical movement in the United States. And you can see that very clearly, see the fundamentals which they cannot compromise, see their faith statements, even though they will not discriminate when they are out there overseas. The other remark we need to make about them is that, contrary to what many experts who write on these things say, they are not congregations. There's a clear distinction between a faith-based organization that functions like an NGO and a religious congregation. And that religious congregation simply is that they carry on worship. In terms of how they relate to global poverty, let me give you two examples. I think in the healthcare and education business, especially during the last 30 years, as we have seen in Africa, faith-based organizations have worked collaboratively with local Christian hospitals. The history of that is very long. What they have done, particularly in the last 20 years, I came across a study recently that documents that is that largely from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Global Fund for Malaria and Tuberculosis, HIV, and then other organizations that fund these activities, these organizations have spent probably $1.5 billion, more than $1.5 billion, and we can give you specific information on the specific funding that has gone to faith-based organizations in different parts of Africa. They are a major player if you consider the fact that about between 30 and 40%, depending on the country where you are talking of the healthcare needs of Africa is provided by faith-based organizations or faith-initiated institutions, as sometimes they are called. The other example is what is called the Ecumenical Pharmaceutical Network, which was formed several years ago in order to provide quality medicines to faith-based organizations and their hospitals in Africa. Again, together, all of them are responsible for something between 20% and 30% of all of the pharmaceutical products that are consumed in Africa. That is a huge chunk of money, and if my word huge sounds like Donald Trump, I really mean that. That's a huge sum of the budget in Africa. And so I think what I want to place on the table, and my colleagues will take it further here, is that you cannot eradicate poverty in the African context without dealing with healthcare issues. HIV/AIDS and now the Ebola virus disease has decimated the budgets of most of the governments of sub-Saharan Africa. And in order to address issues of poverty, we have to deal with the health issues. And faith-based organizations are at the forefront. Just one remark, it doesn't mean that there are no problems. There are problems because faith-based organizations now have a large platform. They are now registered with the United Nations organization. And it leaves questions. For instance, here in the United States, the White House has an office for faith-based initiatives and so forth. It raises questions of separation of church and state or the difficulties that would come when you combine religion with non-religious activities. But overall, my view is that they remain key partners in poverty alleviation, especially in the low income and even some of the middle income regions of the world. And I will stop there.
Thank you. So if that's all right, we'll
That's
just go down the line.
fine with me.
Like our
Okay.
introductions. Thank you, Evelyn.
Okay. Thank you, Elaine, for inviting me here today. My perspective is a little different from the other members of the panel. I haven't worked for an NGO, much less a faith-based NGO. I'm a pure ivory tower academic. But what I can offer you today is that I've been involved in 3 separate research projects that look at faith-based NGOs. 2 projects specifically looking at religious NGOs at the United Nations, and 1 project having to do specifically with the global field of human rights NGOs. So I'll tell you what I can address. First, I've been fortunate enough to have done my first project on the United Nations. That was my dissertation. So this was back before 2000. And then more recently, I was part of a 3-year project that took place from 2009 to 2012. So I've been able to see just how much religion at the United Nations has changed in this 10-year period, which was very significant for religion. A lot has happened in the political field during this period, including, for example, both of the George W. Bush presidencies, the movement of religious freedom into the foreground of domestic and foreign policy, and also the attacks on 9/11, which prompted a closer consideration of the religious dimensions of national security. And all of these have given religion a higher profile in the sense that people talk more explicitly about religion, and I could give you some anecdotes and stories about the old days when that wasn't the case, if you like. But other things that I can focus on, we've been asked to orient comments toward how faith-based NGOs operate differently from non-faith-based NGOs. I haven't studied the day-to-day operations of faith-based and secular NGOs, so I can't really speak to that. But we do have some good data from our project. First, there are many differences that we could point to, not to mention differences in how religious and faith-based, how those two words themselves are thought of, not only by religious NGOs themselves, but by secular NGOs. So it's not straightforward at all, and there's a lot of resistance to the label, even by some religious actors themselves, that I'd be happy to speak to. But one of the more interesting sets of findings to me has to do with questions of agenda setting, accountability, and the resource bases that religious and secular NGOs draw from. On average, religious NGOs tend to not only be larger, but also draw more from in-house labor and financial resources. And this makes them less dependent financially, for example, on secular foundations or international organizations when they're drawing resources. And consistent with this, when you look at the factors that, in a survey that we did with NGOs, when we asked them what factors influence their agendas, and we found some really interesting differences. One, secular NGOs, if we look at the statistically significant differences, were far more likely to be concerned with media exposure and external funding opportunities when it came to things like picking which actors they were going to help, which groups they were going to help. Also when it came to picking issues, right, that they were going to address. Religious NGOs, they were significantly more likely, this should come as no surprise, to look to their religious memberships preferences and also to their external governing bodies such as boards of directors, councils of bishops. So you get the impression that no organization is dependent. They all have these organizational dependencies that impact which issues they can take on. And this isn't because of a desire to discriminate, but there is a market of issues, right? And no organization can take on everything. And one of the things that they're most interested in, or that they're very interested in taking into consideration, or one of the things they take into consideration, are things like the likelihood that a group can be helped, right? So the emphasis on things like media visibility, for example, that draws into that. But having said that, even though we see these differences between secular and religious NGOs, what in both categories, what both groups of secular and faith-based actors said were among the most important factors. One of them was whatever was highlighted by the United Nations that year or that decade. So the United Nations will have something like the Year of Indigenous People or the Year of the Child. And you'll see, I don't know if this is the wisest way to go about solving social problems, but sort of a run to go, whatever that issue is that year, to go address those issues. And if it's only on a year-to-year basis, I don't know how many of these issues can really be solved that quickly. But this was a factor that both kinds of groups took into account. And the other one was they were both at the top of their list, I think, if you'll give me one second here. Public perception, of the groups that they were considering helping. So if you have multiple different causes that you can pick up, one of the things they did take into account was what the public perception was of that group. And again, that's motivated by an interest in picking among multiple causes and trying to choose the ones that they think they're going to have the greatest impact with. Or impact on. And there were also some very interesting differences, but I'll wait till later to talk about on how religious and secular NGOs perceive each other. That there are some differences and there are some similarities. There's a lot of goodwill, but there's also a little fur flying across the aisle. So I'd be happy to talk about that as well if that comes up. So, okay.
Well, good evening. Is this on? Good evening, and I bring you greetings from the nation's capital. One thing I was thinking about when Elaine was talking about tweeting, I will answer any question except questions about the presidential candidates. I am so delighted to be away from the Beltway and all that kind of talk. So. So I shan't answer it. Well, I'm delighted to be here and to talk a little bit about my work. Well, in the introduction, Elaine talked about my work with microfinance. And one thing I'd like to say from the outset is that I am no champion of microfinance. I am very cautious about the benefits of microfinance and what it does sometimes to the poor. I'm someone who believes that the poor don't need more credit. What they need is to save more. So I just want to put that out there in case I did this at Georgetown and students, I had to qualify that. So I want to be sure to make that clear. On the other hand, I want to talk a little bit about microfinance and what the importance that that faith-based microfinance organizations and the good that they can bring to the poor. Microfinance is a marvel, isn't it? The 1980s, I mean, they were just the bee's knees. They took the development world by storm. In 2005, the UN had a year named after them. In the World Bank, when I was there at the time, they were naming everything as a result of microfinance. Girls' education, call it this, call it that. It was all due to microfinance. And but then what happened was in 2010, in my own India, we saw what happened when microfinance got out of control. There were very, very, very serious repercussions. There were, BBC called it, I believe, a epidemic of suicides caused by microfinance. Farmers over-indebted to taking more loans killed themselves, and this went all over India. And I believe it damaged microfinance and the way in which microfinance is viewed. Our friends up in the Jameel Poverty Lab in MIT, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, the authors of that wonderful book, Poor Economics, that I highly recommend you all read, are very skeptical about the impact of microfinance. And I believe a lot of that has come from what they've studied and have studied in India. Having said that, I'd like to talk about three things very briefly, and Laura, feel free to come and take the mic away from me if I, of what microfinance, especially faith-based organizations can do. In particular, I'd like to focus on three things: self-control, aspirations, and hope. In behavioral economics, a field which I'm very familiar with, these are terms that are used casually. I mean, one can't really go to a behavioral economics lecture without having things like hope and self-control and willpower and dignity, words that have a religious valence but float freely, it seems to me, from any religious tradition. And I want to talk about the role faith-based organizations have in tethering these to a religious tradition. One is self-control. Self-control, the poor lack self-control. This could be for many reasons. One is that they've got just too many things to do with too little money. Poverty is depressing and it's tiring. It diminishes one's psychological resources. The other could be like that Dylan song, if you ain't got nothing, ain't got nothing to lose. If the poor really don't have anything, this causality is circular. Poverty begets lack of self-control, which begets more poverty. In comes microcredit. There's over-indebtedness. People borrow from Peter to pay Paul, and before they know it, they're in a spiral of over-indebtedness. What can faith-based organizations do? I did a lot of research and have done for many years research on faith-based organizations working with very poor microcredit clients in India, Dalits, outcast women. And one thing that we discovered was that, and this was rather unexpected, that the women in our sample, and we didn't really go out there to focus on these women who were converts to indigenous forms of Pentecostal Christianity. We turned out they were a significant portion of our sample, so we were able to run some good numbers on them. Women who were these converts to this form of Christianity had a very interesting consumption pattern. They saved more. They spent less on temptation goods. When you earn 7,000 or 2,000 rupees a month, and you bring home, say, 200 rupees a day, spending 50 rupees, as I was telling Evelyn, on a cup of chai or a samosa is actually bites into your income. Whereas if you put that money aside and you save it and put it towards a fridge or a motorcycle or something for your family, durable assets, it could have an impact in your future health of your children, or perhaps even put it aside for health insurance. And what these women also did was they were tithers. They were active in religiously motivated giving. They gave to their churches. So when we sort of asked them what could be this reason, and many of them saw their money perhaps as a loan from God, and they had to therefore be careful with the money that they got. And a la Weber, it sort of, I believe, and we're investigating this, so I don't really want to go out, but perhaps there's an association that this could be developed a culture of self-restraint, inner worldly asceticism. This money comes from God. I have to tithe a certain amount. I ought to be careful. So they was sort of an involuntary self-control. The second thing that faith-based microfinance organizations could do is provide the poor with an opportunity to aspire. I have a minute. Well, we could continue this in the questions. And aspirations are forward-looking goals. And there are many things where there's aspirational failure. A person feels that their fate is preordained. And in Tamil, we call it talavidi, or to hit one's head. Oh, this is where I'm at. So what, in fact, faith-based organizations do is, and this particular faith-based micro-organization did, and faith in particular I talk about, is it promoted a radical sense of worth in the women, that they were important, their lives were important, and the impact, it sort of launched them onto a virtuous circle. They felt they had a confidence in their future, they worked harder, and they felt that this was not something that was beyond their reach. They could actually aspire to it. Finally, transcendent hope. I say hope, and I don't mean an inchoate belief that everything's going to turn out fine. I mean hope, and I'm a Christian, and I'm going to come out and say this, as the hope one reads in Romans 8. Hope is now hope. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? For if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it in patience. The same friends up in the MIT lab, when they studied micro-entrepreneurs, they discovered in their wonderful paper, The Miracle of Microfinance, and we found parallels in our study of households that exhibited patience. And what is patience? People who were able to delay consumption in period 1 and invest that income in period 2, that's what they called patience, were more likely to be successful. We said, and we found in our study, and we're trying to develop this and operationalize it. Try operationalizing hope. Try talking about hope to economists. And what we've discovered is, and we're studying this, is this transcendent hope is different from the other hope, because this hope, it's a hope that is beyond the person. In a sense, it outstrips one's own present circumstances. It's a hope that comes from beyond, which is not what one marshals from one's internal resources or from what one feels they can do, but it's a belief in a secure provider. Jehovah Jireh, many of the women we interviewed said, he is there, he will provide, which is why I will put money down for a fridge so that I know next month I can pay another amount for a fridge, or which is why I will send my daughter to a private fee-paying school so she can learn English and not Kannada, so she can get a job in Microsoft. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is faith-based organizations have, if they can harness religion, and because poverty has two types of constraints, an external constraint, we know a lot about that, lack of education, lack of healthcare, lack of credit, but it's also, people are also deprived not just materially, but they're deprived by what we call internal constraints, fatalism, pervasive fatalism, hopelessness, self-control. And faith-based organizations, in my view, are best suited to understand the combination of these factors, then I believe there can be a radical change in poverty alleviation. Sorry for going over.
Well, it's great to be with you tonight. I'm here to represent, you've heard some great perspective and context given from people who are looking at faith-based NGOs. I'm here to kind of represent a perspective from within a faith-based NGO. So, and being here tonight reminds me of being on a panel at the World Bank a few years ago on sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene, where the panelists right before me his last point on his case study was, and you got to deal with the religious NGOs because they're everywhere, which delighted the moderator who turned and introduced me as a leader within a religious NGO. But I mean, we are, religious NGOs, faith-based NGOs are everywhere, which is to be expected in a world where 85% of the population would affiliate themselves with one religion or another. I work at Living Water International, based here in Houston. We work in about 21 countries. We focus on water, sanitation, hygiene services, mostly in rural areas, and we do it in collaboration with a lot of local actors, local and national governments, church networks, local organizations of all kinds. And I also represent, just for context for today, since I'm kind of representing the NGO perspective, I represent a little bit of a broader perspective than the one organization. I happen to serve as the chairman of the board at the Accord Network, which is the Association of Christian Relief and Development Organizations in the U.S. We have about 70 member agencies, including a lot of organizations you would recognize: World Vision, Food for the Hungry, Bread for the World, Samaritan's Purse, and many others, representing about $4 billion of collective budgets that are leveraged in poverty-related causes globally. So the perspective I'm representing to you tonight, I can't say that that's representative of that whole group, but it's a pretty commonly held view. I was asked to kind of couch my comments in terms of what it means to pursue a Christian mission or vision in addressing an issue like safe water, as we do at Living Water, and how our faith gets expressed in the work that we do. And in a word, I would say that the key distinctive is worldview. If you were to interview 100 global development professionals and you ask them, what is the point? What's the end result? What's the goal here? What is it you're driving for? I would gamble. I'd love to see some research. Maybe someone knows of some. I would gamble that 80 of them would answer some variant of something like this. Well, our goal is to see that each person is able to maximize their wealth, their freedom, and their choices, so that they're able to make good decisions toward their own ends, that they're able to be self-determinative. I mean, they would have the capacity, as Amartya Sen would say, to be self-determined. And those are good things. No one would say that those are bad things. We all long for that. But I would say that the key distinctive, the layer that I would add to that from within a distinctly Christian perspective on global development is that we believe that Christian theology has a richer and a deeper understanding of what it means to flourish as human beings. And so if you look at the Christian scriptures, at the Bible, there's this picture of a reality in which all things work the way they're intended to work. So in his ministry on earth, Jesus Christ talked about the kingdom of God, this idea of, if you've read the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the peacemakers, this way of being where all relationships work the way God designed them to work. And so as Christians, we don't, and the Hebrew scriptures as well talk about shalom, this kind of fundamental, profound idea of peace. Of where all things are as they were intended. So as Christians, we're not trying to create utopia here on earth, but we do believe that everything that's wrong in the world, including poverty, is ultimately rooted in broken relationships. And so we can have broken relationships with people in our communities that result in inequity or in abuse. And this is true for all of us. It's part of the human condition, right? It's not just true of the extremely poor. We can have broken relationships with people from far-off tribes, whoever that is to you, that result in oppression or violent conflict. We can have broken relationships with the environment that result in misusing or destroying natural resources. We can have broken relationships with ourselves that distort our self-worth and our understanding of the fact that we have value, that really are those internal factors that you were talking about. And we would say as Christians that with the relationship with God can be broken, which is what gives context to the rest of this. So we can't fix it all, but we do believe that if we address things like water and sanitation and hygiene, like economic poverty, without recognizing this relational web within which it all happens, then we're really only treating symptoms. And so you hear, when you talk to Christian practitioners of development, sometimes you hear them talk about holistic development or integral mission, misión integral, as many people from Latin and Central America would say. That's recognizing this, that the physical and the spiritual are really intertwined, and that ultimately it's all about relationships. So I think is that about my time? I'm happy to dive in the Q&A time and talk a little bit about more of how what are the practical implications of that in terms of the day-to-day operations within an organization. What does that look like in our programs and our partnerships? But looking forward to the dialogue.
So I'm gonna, for time's sake, of the students given lots and lots of questions, we'd be here all night, but so I'm gonna just ask a couple, and just a couple of you answer. Not everyone needs to answer, but let's kind of break it up a little bit in terms of who answers. So one question they have is, in terms of addressing global poverty, can you comment on the parallels and differences between missionary work and faith-based NGOs? So that's the kind of tension and conversation that, at least is their perception, that secular and faith-based NGOs have. Are faith-based NGOs sort of just doing missionary work? Is there a tension there, especially if you go into a nation that's religiously different than the tradition of the faith-based NGO, those kinds of issues? It's a large question, I know.
I think one part of it is that beginning in the 1960s, at least in the African context, the traditional missionary was phasing out, with national churches taking over. But that didn't mean that Western churches that had all of that work were phasing out, they were transitioning. And so I would say probably up until about the 1980s, this transition was going on, with the NGOs coming on board with the UN. At a certain point, I think in Africa, the crisis with so-called failed states, or difficulties, coup d'etat, civil wars, and so forth, then moved some of the work and the money and the personnel that had gone into the traditional missionary. The traditional missionary went for 4 years, the short term went for 2 years. After each term, they came back to the States, or they went back to their country, traveled for a whole year, raised all of their support, and then went back to the field again. So the 4 year would be the career missionary, the 2 year would be the short term. I think I haven't studied this, but I think one can make a case for the fact that the missionary project is curtailed significantly, and a lot of the work that would have been done by career missionary is picked up then by faith-based organizations. Many of them actually sometimes sponsored by the former mission agencies, or sponsored by members of those organizations, except now they have been reconstituted. And in the case of Africa, when HIV hit beginning in 1981, the faith-based organizations were much more active. And as I said, they have done a lot of things, but the bulk of the work then is to take over or work with former so-called mission hospitals, which are now local church hospitals, to do the work.
I have a question for
Yeah.
you. Well, in the NGO universe, often when religious NGOs or faith-based NGOs are asked what their advantages are, one of the advantages, and secular groups will say this about them as well, is that they have these networks and they have ties to local communities that they've developed through long periods of mission work, right? And this is one of the advantages they have now. And I'm just wondering, based on what you just said, about the shortening of the time that they're spending there, and with the NGOization,
Right.
if you will, does that erode at those very structures that might be providing the advantage to begin with over the long term? Like, might there be an unintended consequence there?
They could be, but there is still a path for career missionaries. I don't want to leave the impression here that the missionary work is dead. No, there's still a path, and people are still going into career missionary work. But what you have is that, for instance, almost all mission hospitals in Africa have now become church institutions run by, in the case of my home church, the Cameroon Baptist Convention, except that they just call it the Health Board or the Health Services of the Cameroon Baptist Convention. So the connection that they have with the Global Fund, the Clinton Foundation, and all of the other faith-based organizations that they draw resources from goes to those faith-based institutions. So there's still a connection, but it's just that the actors have become different. They are people who do not go to stay for a long time. Most of them live, in the West, but go on short trips to execute these projects.
Yeah.
So you still have a very vibrant missionary organization, but the faith-based organizations who work with institutions. I think the best example in Africa is the Christian Health Association, and then the sister organization, the Ecumenical Pharmaceutical Network, which coordinates the work of the church hospitals that were former mission organizations.
This is a somewhat related question. So research shows that there's a higher religious participation by women than men almost around the globe. Yet men hold more speaking leadership positions in churches than women generally. This is specifically Christian context, but also in a Muslim context. How does the issue of gender and representation intersect with religious NGOs? Do we see higher participation of religious women than men? How is gender represented in the leadership structures of faith-based NGOs?
Shall I go?
Yeah, please.
I think that's a wonderful question, and
Brought to you by Rice University students. Yeah.
thank you. Well, I think it's a common misconception. Well, first, let's not shy away from the fact that certainly if one is to turn the television on in northern Nigeria like I was a few months ago, or in my own city of Bangalore, you would have all the people that are running the Pentecostal channels are all men, and they're all dressed in suits. And all the men, all the imams in our local mosque, well, they're men. The priests are men. So let's not shy away from the fact that that happens. However, what I see and what we often don't see is the important work that actually takes place within the faith-based organizations, within the church as well, most of the religious orders. Now, Catholic charities, and in India, and I can speak about India, our hospitals, our schools are run by nuns. A lot of them are run by religious orders, many of whom are women. They take Mother Teresa's organization, Sisters of Charity, they're all women. So they're active in that context, as well as if you go into parts of North Africa and parts of Asia, you can't really get into really tackling key development issues like girls' education, cutting, FGM, HIV even, the use of contraception, health, myriad development issues, unless you have women workers. And a lot of the time it's the church and religious organizations on the ground. Going back to the missions, in India, you couldn't go out into the areas, into the rural areas to talk about health unless you were a female missionary. Female, Hannah Marshman, a lovely, wonderful Anglican missionary, was there with Carrie. She was the one who went out with the Zenana mission to Muslim cloistered women and got them out, checked their health, got them educated in Parda. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, how are we evaluating leadership? If we're evaluating them as, are they on stage? Are they at the forefront? Are they speaking behind the dais? Perhaps not. Should they be? I don't know. Is that what they want? I don't know. But are they out there? Are they a critical, invaluable part of development? Yes. So.
I don't want to jump into it, but I think the question, what makes the question powerful is the fact that we still have gender biases throughout the religious communities. And I think the proportion of women that are involved in faith-based organization or faith-based leadership in Africa is far less. I think we could talk about the downside of these organizations, that in certain communities, these have become personal empires, which are run largely by men for a certain, for certain things which tend to have a very ethnic component to it, introduce certain biases. And the fact that men still do a lot of these things is true. Women are involved, but very few, far too few. The first non-governmental organization, indigenous non-governmental organization that focused on HIV/AIDS in Uganda was formed by the wife of one of the nurses that was infected, and she led a TASO, the AIDS Society organization. But in my remarks here, I did not have time to go into out of the tragedy of Uganda and Burundi. 2 women have formed faith-based organizations which have started a very different kind of conversation. Uganda, particularly after the brutality of Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, her name is Angelina Atime, has formed an organization which is based on her faith as a Christian. Her daughter was abducted, taken into the bush. By the time her daughter managed to escape, she had been raped numerous times, and she had 2 babies from that whole experience with Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army. And so she formed an organization that is active now, that is helping build reconciliation. So I think one would say there is space is opening up for women, but one would also concede not as fast, not as much as one would like to see it.
I want to save time for people to ask some questions, so be thinking of them. But the students have one last very important question, which is best summed up as how then shall we live, I think. What is the best way for each of us personally and potentially for our religious organizations to get involved in poverty relief efforts? Can you give us some touchstones? Jonathan, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I think the movement within the NGO space, and I'm looking to my colleagues who might know more about the broader movement, but my observation is that there is a shift away from the number of cross-cultural workers and direct service providers that are needed on the field today relative to 10 years ago, even 20, 30 years ago. We don't, we're seeing incredible capacities built in many of the countries where development has been happening for many years, where the number of workers isn't needed, but there are still very specific skill roles that within philanthropic organizations generally need to be played at a global level, beyond individual operations within a country. And I'm thinking, talking to a room full of many students, the NGO world is swinging on the rest of the nonprofit space toward a need to measure more impact. So a background in evaluation and applied research goes a long way in getting involved in fighting poverty these days. It's not just development economists and health workers that are needed. We really need people who understand research, who understand how to practically measure impact in ways that have meaning, and not just ways that have meaning in a report that comes out in a couple of years, but in ways that immediately begin to translate into better practice. So, I would encourage you to find the disciplinary path that you have great passion for, that look for ways in which that intersects with the needs and the programming of existing philanthropic organizations that are working in the field, but also be aware that the lines are really blurring now. We were talking earlier today about the emergence of really the social enterprise sector, that the lines between the private sector and the social sector are really becoming a lot less meaningful than they used to be. That social enterprise and using business principles and using economic models that invest in countries' futures is one way that you could really see a major difference happen, and that's happening in both the secular and the religious organizational spaces.
I'll
Sure.
take a stab at this.
Yeah.
I would say educate yourself about the unintended consequences, about what you might be getting involved in. I'm thinking of the story about who's throwing the babies right in the river. Learn about structural adjustment. Learn about the role that NGOs play in that. Learn about the role that faith-based NGOs play in structural adjustment. Who benefits that? How did that happen? Educate yourself about the larger social systems that are creating poverty, right, to begin with, and how NGOs, in some ways, regardless of the good intentions of their members, play a role in furthering some of those social systems, and then make your decisions.
Get really good at listening.
Can I just say one more thing?
Please, yeah.
Well, learn a language. Francophone Africa is woefully underdeveloped compared to Anglophone Africa. French is you have access to learning French in college. I would say learn French. If you're a medical student, take a infectious diseases rotation in Christian Medical College in Vellore, one of the best medical colleges in the world. I've met many American students in Vellore who took a rotation and then went on to be missionaries and mission doctors. A very close friend of mine has just called me saying that he's moving to Rwanda to be from Oxford, who did his rotation in CMC. And I'd like to echo what John said about evaluation. One of my jobs at the World Bank was actually to conduct a quality review of all the human development projects. I was in charge of evaluating to see whether they were going to reach their targets. And sometimes we came across faith-based organizations and they didn't have a clue of what they were looking at, what they were going to do, what the indicators were that they were going to measure to get to their target, what the time frame was. What was the difference between an output and an outcome? Can you measure maternal mortality? It's such a difficult concept. So things like that. Evaluation is a very important tool.
I would add one thing. I would just say one thing we haven't placed on the table is that one of the roles of some NGOs and faith-based organizations, especially when they deal with human rights, is advocacy, which has become quite complex because I think the way it has been done in the past, it has always come across as Western governments lecturing, in the case of Africa, lecturing to African governments. But I think there's still room for a very sensitive type of advocacy and dialogue. Because in the long run, it doesn't really matter what we say. It seems that, I think the data or the studies still show that most African governments have farmed out their political, social, economic responsibilities to NGOs and FBOs. And so there needs to be some kind of advocacy which should not really come as a lecture, but as a sustained dialogue, because it is only when that kind of advocacy and that kind of dialogue continues over the long term that we can even begin to think of the sustainability of some of these programs. Because in the long run, if we go in, people go in and do good, then when they go out, what happens? I think there still needs to be a consistent, robust, but also, I think, a very dialogical approach to human rights, to those values which don't have to be imposed from outside, but derived from the values within these same communities, because they have those values, and see how they could be articulated within the broader context of a political community, because then that creates the basis for sustainability. Because the dialogue, the word about the concern about sustainability now is one-sided. It seems as the blame is put largely on the NGOs and the faith-based organization. I think it's a two-way street. If the context in which they do their work works to create a favorable climate where those institutions can create something that would be long-lasting, I think that would go a long way. And that reflects, I think, my own concerns that the lack of advocacy among the NGOs and faith-based organizations who are very often very satisfied with going in and doing something and coming out makes, the work highly problematic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to take some questions from you. We have time for a few. And are we having questions come in over Twitter as well, perhaps? Raise your hands if you would, and I'll call on you. Yeah, Malcolm.
Dr. Ecklund, there's a fellow with the London Times, Matthew Paris. He is a self-described atheist, as well as practicing other alternate lifestyles. But grew up in Africa, and just a great article, but just one quick statement. Whenever we entered a territory worked by missionaries, we had to acknowledge that something had changed in the faces of the people that we passed and spoke to. There was something in their eyes, the way they approached you. He goes on to describe the happiness, the difference when a faith-based organization had worked in an area versus just the UN or something like that, a humanitarian, that there was a greater love. I think love is what he actually gets into, is the people were recognized as individuals, that they were special, made by God.
Yeah.
I don't know if y'all got to comment on that, and
To sort of know what's the ramifications.
What is the impact? I mean, have y'all seen? I think Jonathan pointed out very, very importantly, especially here at Rice, you're dealing with some really smart students and so forth that can get out and look at measuring what is the impact and so forth. But we see different results when people are there for a different purpose. It's not just about making money. So there's something greater that tends to happen. He's a pretty good writer here. Any comments on that?
Everyone's looking at me. No, from my own research, no, but from the literature review I've done to do my research, I can comment on that a little bit. From some of the studies, I remember that there do seem, in terms of like, if we were to think of it as consumer satisfaction, for example, that yes, to put it in very secular terms, right, that there, I have read research that says that there is more trust, right, attachment, right, these kinds of things. But when it comes to, do the agricultural programs work better? Does the HIV rate go down? It's mixed, right? You can't say that there depends which study. And even where you do find positive outcomes with faith-based organizations, there's still this question, is it the faith in the faith-based organization, or is it the immense resources that faith-based organizations have in comparison to secular organizations? So on those concrete NGO-like outcomes, the jury's out. But on the kind of things you're talking about, I've read other people's research that has said that yes, indeed that's a pattern. Right, that's the case.
Yeah, Rebecca.
I know Matthew Paris, actually. I love his writing. He writes for the Times.
Very unusual.
Yes. So I had no idea he wrote that article. Well, I'd like to draw your attention to one study in particular that I highly recommend. It's a study by an economist by the name of Bruce Wydick. And Bruce Wydick and his colleague Glenwee did an amazing study of compassion. When they first set out, they actually didn't. Compassion said, don't put our name to this study. You can have our database, but don't put our name. And what they did was they they interviewed children. They did a randomized control trial. You all know what that is, you know. So they did that with children who were sponsored and children who were not sponsored. And they gave these children little pieces of paper and told them to draw yourself in the rain. And the children who were sponsored drew themselves with galoshes and with the umbrella and used bright colors. Whereas the ones that weren't sort of drew themselves for the most part like this. And they used these fancy measures, which they believe they took from psychology, to assess how these children perceived themselves. But then they tracked these children. And they found and asked them also questions about what their aspirations were. And this is going back to my definition of aspirations, these forward-looking goals or targets. And children who were sponsored aspired more to white-collar jobs. These are coming from very poor children in Kenya, Indonesia, than children who were not sponsored. And one of the reasons was that these children who were sponsored had letters, were being written to by their sponsors. I beg your pardon, both these children were getting money. I'm going to say that it wasn't non-sponsored, sponsored, but they were both getting money from different organizations, or they were both getting money. But these children were written to by constantly being encouraged. Now, Tom, you're going to do great in this test, and you're going to. And so what they said was Weidich talks about again is these internal constraints of just fatalism or a belief, an aspiration that I can succeed. So it's a very good study. He's doing more work on hope, and this is something that he works a lot on, and he's an excellent chap. And so that's a study and his work to watch out for.
Rebecca, we've had some come in, just breaking news on Twitter for you. So directly for you, are you saying your research shows that poverty is due to lack of self-constraint or belief in transcendent hope? A follow-on question, faith-based organizations can give the poor better ethical frameworks from which to act. So are you saying that the faith-based organizations can give the poor better ethical frameworks from which to act?
I'm not just saying that internal constraints are the only constraint. What I am actually saying is when one understands poverty, the dimensions of poverty aren't just material or physical. They are that as well as these other dimensions that I talk of. For example, what animates someone, what moves them at the deepest level are their beliefs, are they wanting to commune with the transcendent, is a feeling of belonging, of their worth, of their dignity. Dennis Goulet put it like this when he talked of development practitioners who disregarded these non-material dimensions. He said they were like one-eyed giants. So in a sense, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that it's not just these internal constraints. What I'm saying, it's the combination of the both. And it's the ignoring of the one, which is very easy to ignore, partly because it's very hard to model self-control, hope, and aspirations. It's very hard to model that. Try doing an economic model on that. Try measuring that. It's much easier to model these sort of firmer external constraints. What I'm saying is that these are important and they contribute to deprivations. It's multidimensional. Poverty is multidimensional. So.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, you.
Hi. So I imagine there must be a faith-based organization of other religions, I imagine. So I have a question. So as a Christian, of course I would think Christian-based NGOs are doing a fantastic job and you're doing great things. But how do I view NGOs of different religions for what they do? Because, of course, what they do, they help poor, they fight poverty, but they also put their worldviews in people's. So, I mean, maybe I just want to know what are your comments on it, and do NGOs of different religion fight for people, or?
directed toward?
Any of you, jump in, jump in.
No, I think that could be characterized as one of the weaknesses of our presentation here is that we speak from what we know. But I can say for a fact that both in Cameroon and Nigeria, there are Muslim NGOs that are very, very active in the work they do. In South Africa, where we have far more religions that have their origin in Southeast Asia, there are many faith-based organizations. Those communities do similar kinds of projects. I think the fact that we have referred or used illustrations from the Christian tradition just reflects our background. But other religious organizations, I can think of the Hindu communities. There are numerous Hindu organizations here in the United States that are very active, even within the United States, and raise a lot of money that goes to different parts of the world and different projects. So in short, what didn't come out, did not come out largely because of I think, the things we have done or what we have studied.
And maybe this is relevant as well. I know in your research, you commented that that the Christian organizations seem to be unique in that they're more ubiquitous.
Yes.
Where Muslim or Islamic NGOs would tend to be more present in Islamic majority countries, and Hindu NGOs would tend to be more in Hindu majority countries. Is that a finding?
That's part of it, but let's not also forget that there is a fundamental Islamic ethic, which, whether you look at it in terms of zakat, the gift giving, the sharing, which is mandatory in Islam, I think there's a lot that goes on there that eliminates the need for a structured organization or institution. By Islamic law and practice and ethics, members of the community are supposed already to be doing that. Then in economics, you are supposed to give out loans without interest and all of those kinds of practices which are built into the basic understanding of the ulama, the Islamic community. Again, if I speak beyond that, I will be making lots of mistakes because that's not my expertise. So I'm just saying, I wonder, even where you have a preponderance of Christian organizations, if in the Islamic community, those are not offset by the fact that in Islamic life and culture and ethics, it is already mandatory to do those things within the community.
Yeah, way in the back. Yes.
I was wondering about people who fall through the cracks of the structures that faith-based NGOs provide. For example, I'm thinking of the LGBTQ community. I don't want to make a blanket statement that all faith-based NGOs would ignore such a community, but I think that there's certainly a majority that might. So I was wondering if you could speak to, is that solely the role of secular NGOs, or how do we better serve those communities if you've said that, faith-based NGOs can be so effective?
Good question.
I can just throw in a comment. The dialogue about the LGBT community is really not at the level in most of the places where we work that it is in the U.S. I mean, in rural communities in Africa, I'm sure there is an LGBT community, but they're undercover. No one knows who they are. It's not a known issue, so we wouldn't be able to identify them if we wanted to. In many of the countries, it's technically illegal to be homosexual. So it's not something that we encounter openly. I would say that from an organizational point of view, I can only speak for my organization, we're committed to serving all people regardless of anything. We encounter people who have need, we want to serve them. The challenges would come more from within their own culture than they would from the faith-based organization that's doing the work alongside the local community.
Can I just say that from my experience in India with the Christian hospitals. Now, we don't have, at least, we have what's called hijras in India, were eunuchs. They're actually eunuchs, and they're eunuchs for various reasons. They were given away as children, and a lot of them are trafficked and so forth. But at a time when, in the late 90s, when the AIDS epidemic had taken off and it was really raging around the Mumbai and Bangalore, the hospitals that served this community, because these were male prostitutes, the hospitals that served them and the sex workers were the Christian hospitals. Of course, there weren't that many private hospitals, but they took them in, and to this day, if you study and you can assess, I would imagine, I haven't looked at any paper in the last 5 years, but I would imagine the data is similar. The organizations that provide the care to HIV/AIDS parents, children, and even sex workers are the Christian hospitals. They provide these long-term care facilities where, when they have full-blown AIDS and they go there and there's not access to retroviral drugs, it's the Christian communities, because there is an ethic where care is provided for all. Christian Medical College in particular has one of the largest outreach to the HIV/AIDS community in that area, in South India in particular.
Let's take one more. Yeah.
I have a question that follows on Dr. Bush and Dr. Bongma's conversation a little bit earlier about advocating within the political and structural regimes within the countries. I'm curious whether or not religious NGOs have more of an opportunity or more of a challenge in this advocacy. And my one data point, I had the opportunity 15 years ago to do a small research project in Cuba, where the Catholic Church, and it's certainly unique in their population, was able to put forth conversation and have dialogue that a lot of other organizations couldn't because of the political system. And so I'm wondering, in your experiences, if you see that as more of an opportunity or a challenge for organizations.
That's going to depend on the context.
Yes.
I mean, that's going to have a lot to do with religion-state relations, whether or not there's religious persecution in a particular context. One of the difficulties, for example, that I had in creating, it was a data set of religious human rights NGOs, is that there are different incentives for even declaring a faith-based identity as you move from country to country. So you can't go to a directory in China, right, and compare it to the US and count Christians, right, or count Christian NGOs. So it would depend, I think, largely on that. That would be one factor that I think should be taken into consideration. And even if it's a context where there's no overt hostility to religion, there's going to be, is this liberation theology? Like, what's the history there, and so on, of religious activism, and has it been anti-government, and so on, and
So that sounds like more of a challenge, right?
yeah, there can be challenges, but in other places, one of a flip side of that, in some countries, if you look at social movements that have faith-based components, it looks bad for a government to attack a religious organization, so you can take cover, right? In places where where if you were secular, you're more vulnerable to attack. So again, depending upon the context, like the national context, the time in history, the religion state regime, and so forth.
On the upside of that question, a couple of examples. Our partner in Zimbabwe is the Evangelical Fellowship of Zimbabwe, which is an association of 350 denominations representing something like 4 million Zimbabweans. So there's huge credibility that comes with the leaders of that group, and they will also work with the Zimbabwean Council of Churches and the Association of Bishops. So there's kind of this broad coalition of Christian actors within the country, and enough respect for religion within the country culturally, that they're able to bring an incredible amount of weight. They've successfully managed to get the government to adopt a very pro-poor policy around water and sanitation access. We've seen similar results. We're friends with Tear Fund, who have done some great work with a Christian coalition called FALE in Brazil. And they've seen some similar success in seeing water and sanitation policies adopted that really benefit some of the more marginalized people in the country. So it can really work in your favor or be a challenge, depending on the context.
I think my own comments reflect actually where I come down on the whole question of political theology. If you were to ask me, I firmly support all of these activities, want it to continue. But ultimately, I think within those countries, there needs to be a more aggressive, robust political theology that calls for accountability and responsibility. Because in the end, all of these are really band-aid solutions. The governments of those countries need to be accountable to the people, develop the infrastructure, whether that is things like building roads, building telephone equipment, providing water, letting the churches run the hospitals. And church hospitals in Cameroon would do miracles if electricity was dependable, if they had water, if they had good roads, if you could be able to order a medication either from Paris or London and it's flown in, or somebody is able to ship something and it does not lie rotten at the seaport in Douala, because you have a set of bureaucrats up to the top who expect that somebody should be bribed before something takes. So you actually see my own view of political theology, that at a certain point, one is caught between saying maybe faith-based organizations should stop and get out and let the bottom fall out, maybe something will happen. But I am more on the side that something is happening, but we do actually really need political engagement. I mean, let me say something that is actually quite politically incorrect. I think after the 1980s, the 1990s, the mistakes of the World Bank and the IMF were criticized so much that the World Bank and the IMF actually chickened out and went back to doing things in Africa that would eventually lead Africa back to where we were in the economies of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and no solution. So I wish churches could stand up like in the old-fashioned traditional sense and march and carry placards and demand that the government should be toppled. Because in the long run, everything we do now is doing good, but the churches are not going to be states. The faith-based organizations are not going to be there forever. In the long run, the states have to accept and assume responsibility for the very people that they have been elected to serve.
This is a lot that we've been through tonight, and it really is just scratching the surface. And tomorrow at 8 a.m. in the Rice Memorial Center, we have an event just for students where we will have Azhar Aziz from Islamic Relief. Jonathan will be with us again, and we'll have our own former Religion and Public Life Program fellow, Colleen Fugate, who will talk about her own efforts along these lines as well. So I encourage you, if you're a student, to come back, and we'll have these esteemed panelists also. We'll have a really robust and more practical conversation tomorrow at 8 a.m. in the Rice Memorial Center. This has been a very engaging conversation, and I have been very honored to be a part of it. And I know that all of our guests here, we really have benefited immensely from your insights. So thank you for getting us started on this journey.
Thank you.